But I'm going to open it up immediately to questions. We've got about 20 minutes or so for people to engage and to either ask questions or make comments of their own. Does anybody want to start us off? Okay, give yourselves a minute to think. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. That was amazing. I've got two questions, really. One is in relation to Mannheim. She comes from Panofsky, and she ends up with Mannheim, and that's very important because Mannheim's crucial to Panofsky and crucial to the invention of iconology. So there's a game going on there in some sense. Mm-hmm. And the other question is when this book is actually completed, as opposed to when it's published. I mean, you segued away from the whole Jewish question, but in 1944. Even by 1942, they are beginning to know that something's going on, which is worse than. And so, is there anything in this book or in this subject which is, as it were, covering up or not talking about another subject, which is obviously on her mind in some ways? That's the other aspect, and I just don't know. It could be that this book is all completely finished by 40, and it takes so long to publish. That happened at that point.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, she's doing it, she's writing and researching it between 40 and 41 and writing it, obviously, that she signs the preface in February 1943, so it takes a while to come out. So, I don't think, I mean, it seemed to me that the way in which she made her choices and what she wrote in going into such overtly Jewish subjects and sort of pinning her art historical colours to that kind of particular mast were kind of such an act of sort of assertive defiance in the face of the dangers. And clearly, I want to track something more about this because, I mean, if everybody's decamping and going off to Cambridge and, you know, hiding and at the same time, and obviously the Battle of Britain is being fought and that might have stayed this, but I mean, it's, you know, she's writing it just at the point at which, finishing, Hitler's going to just go and do Operation Barbarossa and deflect the forces from actually the invasion. So I'm sure, I mean, it's difficult to track, and I think it would need many more personal letters and sort of aspects of it. I didn't find anything in the book because it's so much, it's such a kind of grandiose, I mean, if you know, the writing of it is in that sense of, I mean, no, I was going to put it this way. There is very much clearly a sense that this is all an act against fascism. It's much clearer in the Viola Klein writing. There's a quote which I rushed over when she says, if humanity is going to have to refound itself, we're going to have to start right here now with this. And to that end, her work about what does minority identity do to the personalities of those inflicted with it, right? And she's talking about indigenous people, she's talking about African Americans, she's talking about Jews, she's talking about women. That's the whole structure. So this question, that definitely functions in Viola Klein's thing. The question, it's coded as the minority, and fascism is clearly the other. Now, what Mannheim goes on to do is he participates in this thing called Oldham's Moot. And J.J. Oldham was a Christian socialist who organized the debate that ran from the late 30s through to 1945. And it is for that event that T.S. Eliot wrote his famous essays on culture. And Mannheim writes most of the papers there. And what they are really sort of planning is how will we reconstruct the world in the light of what we're witnessing. So you're right that that's present there. I can't see specific instances of this in this book. But I think there is the coded sense that when, it's rather like Arendt said, when you're attacked as a Jewish person, you stand up as such. It's almost, Rosenau says, okay, this is the time to not hide, not to dissemble, but not in this particular figure because, but as in a sense, the effect of the book is to get us, I mean, even though these terms are so difficult for us to grasp, the notion of what human evolution means, because we keep thinking that we are back in some kind of Attenborough-type field, but it is so deeply concerned with the sort of social malleability and the implications, and if you are this kind of knowledge is situated, it is in that. Now, whether fear registers or terror or not. Viola Klein had to leave both of her parents behind. She and her brother escaped, and I don't know what stage she learnt of what had happened to her parents because they were murdered. But I think maybe the family might know more about this, you know, in that I don't know directly in that sense. But yes, the thing about, I mean, that's what I say. I mean, I feel like I'm just sort of, you know, I know about Mannheim through adult education and the sort of this debate about things, and I'm just getting my head around with this, so there are sociologists present who might be able to sort of take it further. But how Mannheim and Panofsky, could you say something about that? I think that might enlighten the audience as well.
Panofsky's doctoral thesis. Mannheim's doctoral thesis was written on in response to Riegel's Spektrometrische Kunstindustrie, and he finds out of the idea of Kunstwollen in Riegel basically the model that will become his sociology of culture, which goes along with his sociology of knowledge, and that is the most influential text on Panofsky's later German essays in relation to Riegel, which then become iconology. So, for example, the famous tipping of the hat anecdote is in fact Mannheim's anecdote, but yes. In Mannheim it's a beggar. Interesting, yeah. Interesting, much more charged actually. Yeah. And the three levels, the whole lot is in Mannheim already. Mm-hmm. So Mannheim is really is crucial, central to the whole Hamburg intellectual project. Mm-hmm. And it is interesting that Rosenau, of all of this lot, actually goes back to those roots. There's a lot of edge in that story, actually.
But then it becomes very interesting to do a much more detailed comparison between this book and Panofsky. I mean, sort of because, I mean, she's still working with Panofsky indirectly when she's doing her PhD, the second PhD at the Courtauld, or the third PhD at the Courtauld. I don't know quite how, but that's part of one of the things, etc. But that's interesting. So this conversation is there. But I mean, because, yeah. Ideology and Utopia is 1926, but it's not that bit of, it's that bit of Mannheim they're working with?
The Mannheim, I can't remember what it's called now in English. It is in English, his thesis about these things, but it's very influential also on Vint. Vint is Panofsky's student. Okay. So as a group, they're branded as together by the Viennese who defend Riegel in a different route. So and then the presence of Mannheim sociology is part of what attracts Bourdieu to Panofsky, and Bourdieu translates Panofsky into French. So there's a very interesting interface.
But one of the things I would just try to interrupt, because I mean this is great, and obviously requires a whole lot more reading and a whole lot more kind of getting my head around that. But the danger then is that we're going to end up with, you know, the intellectual genealogy that, you know, has a sort of validity and not see the specificity of the daring with which Rosenau then says, okay, I'll take on such an incredibly topic, and, you know, the whole question of, you know, reading the footnotes, tracking things, you know, the whole kind of intellectual formation that she's drawing on is the kind of thing that is necessary kind of feminist, because you just have to sort of jump the hurdle and not get right, okay, because like I just see, as you were talking, I thought, okay, there's another 10 years there. By the time I've read my way through all of those, to be able to open my mouth again, I'll have missed the point. You know, she did something interesting with Mannheim without being in that inner circle. So yes, of course, but it's almost, I suppose, also for the students, there's sometimes where you try to work it out for yourself. You know, now I will consolidate that, but by trying to work out what would this conversation be, it's not coming to you at the form of a solidified intellectual history. It's that you know, why is Mannheim with these two women at this point enabling what becomes the initiation of gender in sociology and gender in art history, with neither of which then become part of what every student would know if they were studying what Panofsky, the genial of Panofsky. So that agitates on that surface there.
Griselda, thank you for that simply wonderful talk. It's going to be quite a long time to process it and think it through. It's wonderful. I think just to take up what you're talking about, the way in which Rosenau particularly enters this Mannheimian world of subjective knowledge, if you like, I think it's very important what you've put in place there, and to think about very intensely about the subjectivity of a particular woman at a particular point, with the formation of which she's part and not a part. Because it's clearly, I think you're right to miss the Institute out as a major formation. Although she's in touch with it, clearly, she's not in it, she's not of it, she's been put outside it in a certain very important way. And I just want to say anecdotally, one of the things she said to me once was that she became a feminist when she was going to a series of lectures which she thought were the best she'd ever heard by a woman professor. And then she found out it was Simmel's wife. And she said, okay, that's it, we are better. And that was in about 1928 or something like that. And I think you've given that anecdote a very, very profound meaning, I think, and this notion of a form of subjectivation then enters back into it. So I think the other thing which I think is important, I was discussing recently with Ben Thomas, who's at the back there, is that it doesn't just revise the notion we think of what are these histories of woman and feminism, but also what we mean by left, being on the left. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of hijacked by the Shapiroites in a big way. The kind of left was a kind of male space where people knew their Marxism. And the more we look into these forms of social activity and gesture, the more that people like, say, Rosenau and Vint himself seem to be in a different kind of left, which we can now bring back in the way you have brought it back, to see what it means for ourselves to be that as well. So I kind of like to throw that in as a question of what's left in the end too. And to me, she and Vint were leftists.
I mean, I think it links up with what Josh asked about this, trying to negotiate a way which did not disown Marxism, but could do, in a sense, what I suppose, I mean, I think that I do. I mean, that there are things to think with that are profoundly important, but there are also things to think about that are profoundly important. And certain kinds of enactments, when Marxism becomes a kind of, what Mannheim is sort of an ideology, it doesn't leave the space for that kind of reflexivity that is necessary to doubt yourself. And that seems to me the crucial thing for a kind of a left that doesn't have the answers, but is what she's also trying to do in the model that comes out of the book, is you have to do this long-term interrogation of all the evidence to find how you're going to make the kind of necessary and perpetual adjustments of a position that is extremely clear, you know, anti-fascism, you know, and to some extent deeply anti-free market capitalism, but not by therefore falling into something which inhibits thought, because the whole process of producing, so it's not just the subjectivity, I mean, it's in producing knowledge that only a subject can produce knowledge, and a subject is someone who is an existent, i.e., this is, I get into all this problem with the Heidegger about ontic and ontological and existence and the essences and I mean, all of these, this sort of big debate with Heidegger and Jaspers and Arendt at this particular time, but so I may be misrepresenting that, but what I grasp about that idea about, in the sense of taking the design, the sort of the existence question, is therefore already classed and gendered and raced, but not in ways that even if I say that, we still have that categorical thing. Okay, here's my class, but here's my gender, here's my sexuality. So, but these are the conditions of producing forms of knowledge by means of which transformation can occur. So you're right, it's a form of being critically engaged with challenging questions.
Can I say something in relation to that, though? Sorry, you were in the middle of a sentence.
It's all right.
No, I just wanted to say that listening to you here and listening to this discussion gives one a sense of the kind of extraordinary intellectual ambition of the book. But the experience of reading the book is very different, because she wears her knowledge very lightly.
Yeah.
And so in case any of you are thinking, oh my God, I don't want to go and look at that term because, you know, do I have to go down this path? What is so extraordinary is she has this amazing scholarship, and she has this range of references, but this allows her to make the most extraordinary juxtapositions, whether it's Rembrandt's Jewish Bride with Hepworth, or things that seem to completely transgress historical patterns that we've become accustomed to. There's an amazing, almost anarchic freedom with which she skirts civilizations and cultures and histories, and without being a formalist, she finds a kind of new way of a kind of political reading of putting things together, and it's completely and utterly thrilling, and it has none of this kind of heaviness that we could get into in describing this. And I think it's quite important to try and bring that into the picture as well. Mm-hmm. You know, what gives her that voice that allows her to be so extraordinarily, just free in the way in which, and, intellectually agile in the way she puts things together. And maybe you could say a little bit about those amazing kind of artistic juxtapositions.
I think that you're absolutely right, because we don't want to get too bogged down, but it's absolutely what I wanted to convey, which is there is a very serious grounding of how you construct something like this. So it is free, but it's the question that I ask myself in my work all the time now is, by what logic am I allowed to put together what I want to put together? So something like my virtual feminist museum, are there other logics which are sustainable? Okay. Otherwise, people just think and what I think happens a lot today in kind of contemporary, I'll put this and that together. I mean, always trying to say to you, I don't know that you can, maybe you can, you probably have permission to, because we can do anything we like, but ask yourself, what's the logic that would hold that? Is there a historical logic, or a sociological logic, or an anthropological logic, or, something has to say, I can break the rules, I can completely refuse movement, period, style, nation, master, and oeuvre, and say these things are dynamic. Pictures are doing something, images are doing something, and they are rooted in their cultures and they're rooted in personalities that make them, but there are other ways of putting this together. So I don't like the idea of freedom and anarchy, because I think there's a profound ethical question, which goes back to the politics. What's the grounds of even imagining you could do this? And until we get the grounds clear, she just becomes a kind of slightly eccentric, it's always it's again, I'm sure this is what people think about my work. Now she's got very eccentric, she wants to put Picasso and Mary Cassatt in the same room together, nobody would do that, that's not possible. But of course, it's not because, it's not just because I think I fancy doing it, but there's, what would be the knowledge that would be produced where the sort of situated subject positions or subjectivity of that which is represented by those works, where you ask them what are they doing, not which year is this Picasso in, how does it fit in the great story of how great he was, etc. When you put like a series of kisses together, okay, what would you learn about how we figure passion? Right, in a different kind of way, but it has to have that sense there's a logic. And it's not that, we can just, feminism or any of these things just decides to throw over an order. It's to reveal how utterly, utterly destructive, when it is the only order you're allowed to know, the canonical order is. It is a form of knowledge, but it's a form of knowledge that disowns its own, not just situatedness in the Donna Haraway way, all knowledge is situatedness, but this much deeper Mannheimian notion that it is knowledge because it's the knowledge produced by a subject in awareness that it's produced by a subject. And therefore it's answerable to some larger question or some logic which wouldn't sustain it. So you're absolutely right. but the interesting thing about the book, when you sort of delve into it, then, as it senses, is when you plot out what are the things to think with, who's in those footnotes. Like, I mean, how many of you know about Jane Harrison? Anybody ever heard of Jane Harrison before? Great, you see, there's important figure. But you see, that's it. She's just one of the most extraordinary thinkers about art. She's written these massively important books. Everybody who mattered read them. But she's not part of our intellectual things. And so when you see that she was there, so there is a sort of Virginia Woolf room of one's own, because she does talk with the Stella Bowen. What are the conditions for women being creative? She talks about vitality, something, and concentration. So she doesn't want £500 and a room of her own. You have to have access to your body, right? But you have to have the sort of Arendtian possibility of talking to yourself. You know, Arendt says thought is when you converse with yourself. You know, there's a solitude, not a loneliness. So it's really become a very interesting pattern for me to see actually all these bits and pieces that you kind of carry around separate things, they have these moments of coming together, and to read this in relation to the ambition of de Beauvoir, sort of gesture, then we begin to see what kind of, you know, intellectual architectures, which are also political architectures, can be constructed, which will not just come across as these are the sort of eccentric disorders, you know, it's not like Radian said about, I wrote this, it's about the revealing the unreason of art history, not the irrationality of feminism. So I think that's an important pressure.
Yeah, my question has to do with situatedness, and because I was wondering, I felt that you talked about the reasons why she might have turned to Jewish architecture as a theme of her studies in a different way, as you talked about the way she turned to, you know, looking into women in art. And so, you know, with the Jewishness, and I completely understand that, you know, it is about this forced identification with being Jewish through the forced exile. So that was one thing, and the other thing was, you know, why did she start to work on women? And this you more explained with these complex intellectual legacies. So I felt there was a different way in which you approached that.
That's a great, great question. Thank you. I wouldn't want her taking up Jewishness to be just seen as the forced identification. Just to kind of correct what for the impression I gave, it's a political act, right? It's an act, it seems to me, in a certain kind of way, but at the same time, it's also a demonstration of everything, and it may pick up on Josh's question now that I think about it, everything that enables the kind of sort of racist and structure or the exclusionary structure that she experienced. Because obviously once you begin to say, okay, what is this form, the synagogue? What does it owe to an idea called the temple? How does this interact with other ways that other cults, cultures, rituals find forms for what they do? So if you have, you know, you can do Islamic architecture, you can medieval architecture, Christian architecture, you could Jewish architecture. But when you ask yourself this question, here is something which people create as a form. What are they forming the form for? Right? So the big question is not, you know, there used to be a temple, then there came a synagogue, etc. But what then can the architectural form tell us about the nature of a certain kind of on the one hand, way of being, and then way of understanding the universe. And then this has got to intersect, because you start saying, well, is it a basilica form? And, you know, how does it impact? Because she has lots of interesting things about the intersection between synagogues and Protestant churches, etc. But at the level all the time, as to what happens when you understand how that form changes. Right? So it's not here's a Jewish form and here's a Christian form, but here is form making as part of a kind of certain sense of an articulation of a particular set of rituals or beliefs that the rituals imply. And therefore this is produced. Right? So in the same way that she's going to say that about when she's going to come to talk about woman, right? Woman constitutes this idea. It's a form. It's a form that is produced as an articulation of certain ideas and beliefs. So we arrive from the notion that there isn't an essential Jewishness or essential womanness, there's not a givenness of anything. You're always asking, as an art historian, that's what her contribution is what form gets produced and then what gets articulated as these forms converse with each other, right? So if we ask ourselves a question about wives and mothers, we may need to talk about the Pharaonic Egypt representations. You know, we will have to deal with Akhenaten, but then we might end up with the Jewish bride because we've created something where we understand a form, right? Not something given that gets represented, but a form through which certain things can get thought. So that's why I was suggesting that the way she ultimately in her final book thinks about the visions of the temple, what is this idea that seems to have appeared in different ways, different times, and given different kinds of forms, in the same way as what is the idea of woman, but it doesn't have a content. It's a will, I mean, I know it's a bit too Hegelian, it's a will to a form, but there's something that causes the form to emerge, and then people think with it and vary through it. So it is, in one sense, very art historical, both of them, but it's would reflect back on the sense of if you had to think about being that kind of subject at that point in time in history, the question is, how will I act in my subjecthood, not my subjectivity, i.e. just my own feelings, but in the nature of an agent, the nature of a thinking being. What is it to think Jewishly or to think, you know, womanly thinking at this point in time in history requires that I have an understanding of that which has been the form of the thinking of it, in which I then situate myself and be able to see if this constitutes both some kind of productive change or what kind of doubt I will have to have about it at that point, not to fall into ideology. Does that make sense? So that, you know, it's I mean, I can take it in terms of, like Chris Davis says, the risk in feminism at one point is if you have been told that you are a ruined, deformed body and empty and nothing good, the tendency of your damaged narcissism is to idealize what might make you really feel good about yourself. And that leads to the sort of goddess, you know, women are wonderful, women are great. But it's clear as a subject, a thinking woman, you know there are problematic issues that you have to negotiate, but you also have to be, you know, atrociously honest about the implications of being formed in this kind of subjectivity. So in the Viola Klein book, she says, what damage does this do to women? Yeah, that means that they're mean as hell, rivalrous, competitiveness, envious, jealous, unable to create genealogies, and that you have to think. So there's no idealization of either position, because it's not an identity, it's a form. Woman, temple, Jew, these are ideas constituted in social, you know, distributions of you in social relations. I think at that point we have to say thank you so much for a really